We're about to jump into a period that's often seen as the real launch pad for a new presidency, those critical first 100 days, kind of a benchmark, right? A sprint where an administration tries to lay out its vision and, start making big changes. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on the Donald Trump administration, specifically those initial actions and policies, that time frame from his inauguration, January 20, 2017, up to April 29, 2017. Now, you've sent over this great stack of sources covering this exact period. Really detailed stuff. They touch on key actions, policy specifics, and they particularly zero in on the big shifts that started in immigration policy.
That's right. And our mission here is, well, to really unpack these sources you've given us. We want to pull out the most important nuggets, the core insights, and help you understand the sheer breadth and speed of the changes that were initiated then. And it's really crucial to state up front, we're reporting on what these sources contain. They document these actions as, factual events, things that happened, and we're going to present that information impartially. We're not endorsing any particular viewpoint here.
Exactly. The goal is just to explore the material you've provided, see what it tells us about this period. So let's get into it. Let's dive into these sources.
Okay. So the sources, they establish the clear starting point, Donald J. Trump becoming the 45th president, January 20th, 2017.
And right away, the material highlights why everyone focuses on those first 100 days. The sources actually describe this period as being marked by a, quote, flurry of executive actions, policy reversals, and controversial statements. Oh, sounds like they really hit the ground running.
Oh, definitely. The sources paint a picture of an administration that was incredibly active across a huge range of policy areas right from day one.
Okay, let's jump into some of those early moves then. The sources detail, a remarkable number of executive orders and actions signed really quickly, like one after another. It wasn't a slow start at all.
No, and the sources emphasize the symbolic importance of day one actions. For instance, immediately after the inauguration, an executive order was signed. The goal, starting to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. This move, according to the sources we have, was a very clear signal about a major campaign promise.
Right, and that pace, it just kept going in that first week. Just a few days later, the material mentions the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy.
Yeah, that's the one banning U.S. funding for international NGOs that perform or promote abortion. That was January 23rd.
Okay, and what else early on?
Another action noted pretty quickly was imposing a hiring freeze on federal employees. The sources seem to frame this as part of a bigger push to maybe reduce the size of government.
And trade. That was a big campaign theme, too.
Absolutely. The sources highlight a huge reversal there, withdrawing the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, trade deal. That happened just 3 days in, a really significant move on trade policy.
Wow. Okay. So domestic policy, trade, what about national security?
The sources show an immediate focus there, too. For example, directing the Pentagon to develop a plan to defeat ISIS. That was January 28th.
Got it. Now, one action that generated a lot of discussion, and it's covered extensively in the sources, was the first version of the travel ban, signed on January 27th.
Yes, that order targeted travelers from 7 specific Muslim-majority countries. And the sources really stress this point. It faced immediate, significant legal challenges, became a major flashpoint extremely early on.
Right. And another really high-profile promise from the campaign trail that showed up fast, ordering the planning for the U.S.-Mexico border wall. That was January 25th.
Yeah, the sources note that this action basically told federal agencies to start the process, figure out planning, construction requirements, explore funding options, clearly setting the stage for that key promise.
The material also mentions an order on religious freedom, January 23rd.
It does, and it notes that critics, according to the source material, claimed it was implemented in a way that effectively targeted Muslims.
Energy policy saw changes too, right?
Definitely. The sources mention the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline on January 24th that reversed a decision made by the previous administration.
And a bit later in this 100-day window, March 28th, the sources say the EPA was directed to review and possibly rescind the Clean Power Plan.
Right, signaling a pretty clear shift in environmental regulation.
Okay, one more from that early flurry.
Sure. The sources also detail an executive order on regulatory relief, signed February 24th. This established that 2-for-1 rule agencies supposed to find 2 old regulations to potentially repeal for every new one they issued.
Looking back at this list, based on the sources, what really stands out is just the sheer volume and the speed across so many different areas, right?
Absolutely. The sources strongly suggest this rapid pace was, a deliberate strategy, a way to signal a fundamental shift in direction for the country.
Okay, so beyond those executive actions, the sources also spend time on key personnel decisions and the administration's first attempts at legislation.
Right. Looking at appointments, the sources list those crucial early cabinet confirmations, people like Mike Pompeo at the CIA,
James Mattis at
Jeff
Defense.
Sessions as Attorney General, Rex Tillerson at State, the people who would be central to actually implementing these new policies.
And the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary gets highlighted. The sources note that one famously required Vice President Pence to break a tie in the Senate. That was also early January 23rd.
And then there's the Supreme Court. A hugely significant appointment noted in the sources is Neil Gorsuch. Nominated January 31st, confirmed relatively quickly, April 7th, fulfilling another major campaign promise related to the judiciary.
But the sources also touch on some, well, early turbulence inside the White House itself.
They do. Notably, the resignation of National Security Advisor Michael Flynn happened after just 24 days. The sources state it was for misleading officials, and they link it to his contacts with Russia's ambassador. Kind of an early sign of internal challenges, and also that intense external scrutiny the administration faced from the start.
Okay, what about trying to pass laws? Legislative efforts.
Well, the sources point to that major effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. That was a huge push. However, they also note that attempt failed in the House on March 24th, a really significant early legislative setback for the administration.
But the material also mentions laying the groundwork for tax changes.
Yes, the administration advocated for large tax cuts, and the sources mention the announcement of a framework for tax reform on April 26th. This sort of set the stage for the big tax bill that came later in 2017.
Okay, let's pivot now and use the sources to take that deeper dive we mentioned. Into immigration policy. It was clearly a major focus from day one, particularly concerning Mexican immigrants during this first 100-day period.
Right, and the sources provide important context here. They remind us of the campaign's really strong emphasis on, building a wall, increasing deportations, tightening border control. That background helps make sense of the policies that rolled out immediately.
So the very first major step, according to these sources, was the Border Wall Executive Action, EO 13767, signed January 25, 2017.
Exactly. And this order, the sources explain, it directed federal agencies to start the process. Planning, designing, figuring out how to construct a physical barrier. It also called for more enforcement personnel, expanding detention capacity, speeding up deportations. The source mentions exploring funding, even reviving something called SBNet, a past high-tech border security idea. But here's a crucial point the sources make. No actual construction of a new wall began during these first 100 days. The stage was set, absolutely, but no dirt was moved yet, so to speak.
Okay. And on the same day, January 25th, another really critical order was signed, Immigration Enforcement Expansion, that's EO 13768.
Right. And this one, as detailed in the material you provided, significantly broadened the priorities for who could be targeted for deportation. And here's where the sources highlight a really key shift, a fundamental change. While the Obama administration had primarily focused deportation efforts on, say, convicted criminals or very recent border crossers, these sources state that under the new policy, essentially any undocumented immigrant could be considered a priority for deportation, regardless of criminal history, how long they'd been here, family ties. It was a marked departure.
Wow, okay. And that same order, it also took aim at so-called sanctuary cities, right?
Yes, exactly. The sources explain that this January 25th EO, plus a related presidential memo, threatened to cut off federal funding. Targeted cities or counties that had policies limiting cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. Specifically, the issue was jurisdictions not complying with detainer requests from ICE, to hold individuals beyond their scheduled release time. The order told the Attorney General and Homeland Security to identify these places.
And the sources also describe an immediate tangible effect, an increase in ICE raids and detentions during this period.
They do. They report ICE ramped up its operations. And the targets weren't just people with serious criminal records. They included undocumented immigrants with minor offenses or sometimes, according to the sources, no criminal history at all. The administration also encouraged local police to get more involved in immigration enforcement through programs like 287G. That program allows trained local officers to perform certain federal immigration duties.
Now, Mexico itself wasn't on the list for the travel ban, either the first version in January or the revised one in March. But the sources point out it still had a significant maybe rhetorical impact.
That's what the sources suggest, that the ban reinforce this broader security-focused narrative. And the public rhetoric from the administration, as documented in the sources, remain heavily focused on Mexican immigrants, often linking them, the sources say, to crime or economic burdens, sometimes using statistics that were, according to these same sources, unverified.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize what the sources tell us about just those first 100 days, specifically regarding Mexican immigrants. You had a symbolic start on the wall, a fundamental widening of who is a deportation priority, direct threats against sanctuary cities, a noticeable uptick in enforcement actions.
And that persistent negative public rhetoric.
Yeah. The sources also note these policies immediately faced legal challenges and signaled a really sharp, abrupt shift in the government's direction on immigration.
And the material makes it clear this wasn't just a 100-day phenomenon. The groundwork laid then evolved into even bigger policy changes later on.
Exactly. The sources detail how these initial steps led to further actions throughout the administration.
Okay, so let's look at how the border wall funding and construction story played out after those first 100 days, based on the sources. Well, the sources indicate getting the money was a constant struggle. They mention a compromise bill in March 2018, $1.3 billion, but only about $25 million of that was for planning and design of new wall sections. Most of the early constructions, starting around October 2017, involved replacing or upgrading existing fences. Some new sections were added by late 2018, but the sources are explicit. The grand, full-scale wall that was envisioned was never completed. Too many funding issues, legal challenges, logistical hurdles.
Right. And the sources also detail what became one of the most intensely controversial policies, family separation.
Yes. This is linked to the zero-tolerance policy announced by the Attorney General in April 2018. The policy directed prosecution for everyone caught crossing the border illegally. The sources explain this meant parents were sent to federal jail for prosecution, while the children were separated and placed in government shelters or foster care. The material reports over 2,600 children were separated this way. It highlights the widespread condemnation, both domestic and international, and mentions a federal judge ordering reunification in June 2018. The sources call it one of the administration's most controversial moments.
Okay. The material also covers the actions taken regarding DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program.
Right. DACA, the sources explain, was the Obama-era program protecting young immigrants brought to the U.S. as children, the Dringers, from deportation. The administration announced it was ending DACA on September 5, 2017, gave Congress 6 months to find a legislative solution. But the sources describe how that led to ongoing legal battles. Courts initially blocked the termination. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled in 2020 that the way the administration tried to end DACA was unlawful. And the material notes this had a huge impact on Mexican immigrants, specifically, as so many DACA recipients are from Mexico.
There was also action on something called the Public Charge Rule. What the sources say about that?
They detail an expansion of this rule in August 2019. It basically made it harder for immigrants to get green cards or visas if officials thought they were likely to use certain public benefits in the future, things like Medicaid, food stamps, housing aid. The material states this policy was seen by many as rooted in that earlier rhetoric about immigrants being a burden. And it apparently created a lot of fear and confusion, including among Mexican immigrants, possibly discouraging people from using essential services they were actually eligible for.
And the sources also point to a general trend of reducing legal immigration channels.
Yes, several measures are listed. Things like increased scrutiny and delays for family-based visas, and significant cuts to the number of refugees allowed into the U.S. The sources give figures. From about 110,000 in fiscal year 2017 down to 30,000 by FY 2019. There was also that push for a more merit-based system. According to the sources, these changes tended to disproportionately affect immigrants, including those from Mexico who are trying to come through existing legal pathways.
And for people seeking asylum at the southern border, the sources cover the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, often called Remain in Mexico.
Right. This policy started in January 2019. It required many asylum seekers arriving at the U.S. southern border, even if they weren't from Mexico, to wait in Mexico while their U.S. immigration cases moved forward. The material reports over 71,000 people were sent back under MPP, often ending up in dangerous conditions in Mexican border cities. Critics, the sources note, argued it endangered vulnerable people and violated international asylum laws.
And finally, the sources briefly mention other asylum restrictions and expedited removals.
Yeah, things like new rules limiting who could even apply for asylum. For example, requiring them to have sought protection in a country they passed through first. And measures to speed up deportations for those deemed ineligible. The sources indicate these policies combined made it significant.
So, stepping back and looking at the whole picture painted by these sources on immigration, it's consistent. They describe a really dramatic pivot, a fundamental shift towards prioritizing enforcement, border security, and reducing both illegal and legal immigration.
Exactly. And for Mexican immigrants specifically, the material highlights this increased risk of deportation, much harder paths to legal status, harsher treatment at the border, and just a general climate of fear and uncertainty. The sources state these policies had really profound, lasting impacts.
Okay, let's broaden the view again, like the sources do, and cover some other significant areas during just those first 100 days.
Sure. Foreign policy saw some key actions highlighted in the material.
For instance, authorizing that missile strike against Syria on April 6th. That was in response to a chemical weapons attack blamed on the Syrian government.
And then April 13th, the sources note the U.S. used the MOA, the largest non-nuclear bomb against an ISIS tunnel complex in Afghanistan.
There were also important meetings with world leaders mentioned. The sources highlight President Trump meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, April 6th and 7th. Discussions focused on North Korea, trade, pressing issues.
Right. And the material also notes continued pressure on North Korea during this period and efforts to strengthen ties with NATO allies, but that was often paired with criticism about how much those allies were spending on defense.
And Israel.
The sources point to reaffirming strong support for Israel and signaling a potential move towards recognizing Jerusalem as its capital, which happened later.
Okay, beyond specific policies, the sources also get into the administration's public communication style and some of those early controversies.
Yeah, one really notable instance they mention is the president's claim on March 4th about being wiretapped by the Obama administration. The sources note this claim was made without presenting evidence and was widely disputed by intelligence officials.
And the relationship with the media.
The sources describe repeated criticism of news organizations, often labeling them fake news.
They also indicate the administration faced criticism for making statements in speeches or interviews that were described by fact-checkers as false or misleading.
And the material points to instances where the administration publicly criticized the FBI and the Department of Justice, often related to the ongoing investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 election.
There's also mention of public statements denouncing protests, like the NFL players kneeling during the national anthem.
Yeah, and even those early disputes over the size of the inauguration crowd are noted in the sources. They're presented as sort of reflecting the administration's combative relationship with the media and, at times, with verifiable facts.
What really stands out across the sources, though, is the unique way they communicated.
Right, while they held traditional press briefings.
The sources give huge emphasis to the extensive and often aggressive use of Twitter.
Exactly. The material describes Twitter being used as this primary tool to talk directly to the public, announce policy shifts, attack opponents, praise supporters, comment on events basically in real time, often bypassing traditional news outlets entirely.
Okay, let's quickly touch on the economic and regulatory focus areas the sources highlight from those first 100 days.
Sure. The material mentions a proposed budget blueprint, released March 16th. It outlines some pretty deep proposed cuts to many social programs and government agencies, EPA, State Department included, signaled a real shift in spending priorities.
And deregulation was a big theme too, right?
Huge theme. The sources mentioned signing legislation on February 3rd that repealed some Obama-era financial regulations. This was presented as part of a much broader push to roll back regulations across different sectors: energy, education, finance.
Right, we mentioned the energy piece earlier that focused on energy independence, promoting fossil fuels, downplaying climate change concerns, especially through EPA actions.
And the stock market. The sources note it initially surged after the election, sometimes called the Trump bump in the material, though they also mention volatility increased later on.
Okay, so trying to bring all these different threads together now. The sources are really consistent in how they characterize these first 100 days. The descriptions that keep coming up are things like rapid policy shifts, aggressive use of executive power, and intense media scrutiny.
Yeah, they reiterate that core focus during this initial period: deregulation, major immigration restrictions, and a really concentrated effort to dismantle key Obama-era policies. The material also keeps mentioning that backdrop of constant legal battles and that notable White House staff turnover right at the beginning.
What about public opinion, briefly?
The sources generally indicate that approval ratings were lower than most modern presidents at this 100-day mark. But at the same time, the period was marked by extremely high visibility and almost constant controversy.
So wrapping this all up, based on the sources you provided, What does this intense look at the first 100 days really mean for you, the listener? Well, the material seems to clearly show just how quickly a new administration can attempt to implement its agenda, especially using executive actions, across so many fronts at once.
Right, and it shows how those foundational actions, especially in a complex area like immigration, weren't just symbolic gestures. They really did lay the groundwork, according to these sources, for major, often very controversial policies that continued to shape debates and indeed lives for years afterwards.
So understanding this initial sprint, this first 100 days, it really helps contextualize the whole trajectory of the administration and its lasting impacts. And that wraps up our deep dive into the sources covering the first 100 days of the Trump presidency. Thank you again for bringing all this material to us so we could explore it together like this.
And maybe to leave you with a final thought, something to consider based on everything we've just unpacked from the sources. Think about the stark contrast the sources illustrate between the immigration approach of the previous administration and the really rapid fundamental shifts started by the Trump administration in just these first 100 days. We're talking deportation priorities, DACA, border security focus, asylum rules, everything changing so fast. What does that swift, dramatic divergence in policy tell us about maybe the inherent power of the presidency itself and the potential for incredibly swift, almost immediate change within the U.S. system right after an election?
That is a powerful question to chew on based on